George Galloway.
Men can't tell tales, Mr. Deputy Speaker, and Dr. David Kelly isn't here to answer what I believe were several unwarranted interpretations of events surrounding him given by the Right Honourable gentleman who has just spoken. The words of Lord Hurd that the circumstance we now find ourselves in is a scandal is one compounded by the acres of empty green benches all around us today. There are some 30 members of the House present. There are some 7 members of the Labour Party which took us into the war, and most of those were resolute opponents of the war. And another is in the dock in the inquiry, and I'll come to him later. The Schleswig-Holstein question took a long time, but that's because nobody knew the answer. Everybody knows the answer to the question why Sir John Chilcot has come forward a week before our debate, when he knew that it was on the order paper, to tell us that this inquiry will not report before the general election. Everybody knows the answer to that. However much flannel is pulled around it, it is to avoid the fact that the report can only highlight the ironclad consensus that existed at that time between the two front benches. The Prime Minister and his acolytes, only one of whom has the courage to be here today, and the leaders of the opposition, the then leader, who isn't here today, but whose principal role in these matters was to egg the Prime Minister on to war bigger and faster, as those of us who were here well remember, bitterly remember. I declare an interest, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I am the maker of the film The Killings of Tony Blair, which will be out soon and will no doubt hugely benefit from the postponement of the Chilcot report. In the absence of Chilcot, we'll have to be the report. But I have many other interests of a non-pecuniary nature in this, because like some of my friends who were not so gullible as the highly expensively educated Right Honourable gentleman who's just spoken, we did not look into the Bambi eyes of the then, I'm talking about his university. I probably helped to pay for it. Of course.
Just for the record, I went to a secondary modern school.
But you went to an expensive university that the rest of us paid for. The Right Honourable gentleman says, and many others now say, that they gazed into the Bambi eyes of the then Prime Minister Tony Blair, and he was their Prime Minister. What could they do except follow him over the cliff? What kind of parliamentarian takes such an approach? Because somebody tells you something is true, you must follow them, when the consequences were easily predictable, were predicted by millions of ordinary citizens out in our streets, without the benefit of that education, without the benefit of a seat in this House. What kind of parliamentarian is a question I want to concentrate on, because I could talk for hours, and usually do, regularly do, about what this has all cost the people of Iraq, the people of the wider region. But I want to concentrate on what it has cost us, and I don't mean financially either. When the Chilcot inquiry was announced in this House, I described it as a parade of establishment flunkies, who will now say that I was wrong. I decried the fact that there was no soldier on the committee. One could have had the Right Honourable gentleman who opened this debate, a man who knows what military affairs are about. I decried the fact that there was no lawyer on the panel. I had in mind the Right Honourable and learned gentleman for North East Fife, who could have covered for the fact that there was no parliamentarian on the panel. I decried the fact that nobody would recognise some of the panel members if they were sitting next to them on the Clapham omnibus, and it was difficult to understand why they had been chosen. I decried the fact that two of the members of the panel had described Bush and Blair as the Truman and Churchill de nos jours. They talk about parti pris. They were proselytizers for the war they were now being asked to inquire into. No sooner had the panel been appointed than the principal gatekeepers who were appointed to the inquiry panel, and I'm grateful to the Right Honourable gentleman for that information. He's in our film, by the way, and very eloquent too. That the principal gatekeeper to the Chilcot inquiry was the principal gatekeeper between the Foreign Office and the intelligence services and ministers in the run-up to the war. Talk about parti pris. These individuals were either unqualified or were disqualified from participation in this inquiry. That it has taken so long and been so expensive would, of course, be tolerable if our position in the world had not continued to deteriorate and the conditions in the world had not continued to deteriorate. I tell the Right Honourable gentleman who spoke earlier and who's, as I said, in the dock here, he will never escape from the consequences of what he said and done. He looks to me a haunted figure compared to the spring-heeled Jack that he used to be. As well he might, because he will never escape from it. It will follow him to the grave and into the history books that he proselytized for something which has turned into an unmitigated catastrophe for the world, but also for us. I don't blame Sir Jeremy Haywood, Sir Humphrey. I don't blame even the Chilcot inquiry. I don't blame Tony Blair, at least for this. I blame us. This is a poor excuse for a parliament, Mr. Deputy Speaker, if only members of it could more clearly see so. It is a poor excuse for a parliament that sets up an inquiry, funds an inquiry, and then says 3 parliaments on, as the former Defence Secretary said, 3 parliaments on, we might, who knows when, we might get the fruits of that inquiry. This is Pontius Pilate. This is washing our hands of something which is bleeding us at home and abroad. What do I mean? I mean this, Mr. Deputy Speaker. This has cost us millions, yes. It's cost us 6 years, yes. But the world is hurling to disaster. The decisions that were made in here on the basis of the arguments made by the government at the time has torn Iraq and its region asunder. It has fantastically, unbelievably, incalculably inflated the danger of extremism, fanaticism, and terrorism. Iraq no longer exists as a state. 1/3 of it is controlled by the heart-eating, head-chopping, amputating, crucifying, so-called Islamic State, and members still will not say that they were wrong, let alone the Prime Minister skating around in Davos. Mr. Blair, the former Prime Minister, who still says he was right and would do it all again. Iraq had no weapons of mass destruction. The argument for the war was therefore false if it was not a falsehood. It has been a catastrophe, and I told the then Prime Minister, there are no Al-Qaeda in Iraq, But if you and Bush invade, there will be hundreds of thousands of Al-Qaeda in Iraq. Little did I know that Al-Qaeda would spawn something even more horrific than Al-Qaeda. I told the then Prime Minister, the fall of Baghdad will not be the beginning of the end, but merely the end of the beginning. And that the fanaticism and extremism that you will unleash will travel and cascade everywhere, including onto our own streets. So I close here, as I see you're anxious, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I close with this. No one outside can really understand how all these political professionals, highly remunerated, highly rewarded, with all their intelligence and education, can have made such a catastrophic error when millions of people who did not enjoy those privileges outside already knew that it would end in the disaster in which it has ended.